So we don't have any new titles to talk about just about now, so what I thought I'd do was take the opportunity to review what we've done with the series since we set it up best part of 4 years ago now, and go through the books that we've already published. I was going to go through them completely in order, and then I thought that would probably be rather disjointed, so there's hopefully some sense to this, but I will start with the very first one, Lobositz to Leuten, the first of 2 volumes that Neil Cogswell did, based on the papers of Horace St Paul, who was a British volunteer serving with the Habsburg army in the 7 Years' War. These have been a real labour of love. They're full of his journals, and then also a phenomenal number of maps and orders of battle and sketches that illustrate the campaigns that St Paul took part in. Lobositz to Leuten is the first one, and then onwards to Torgau to complete the story up to 1760. There's over 1,000 pages there of material going into great detail, and 2 lovely cover paintings by Peter Dennis to set them off. And that was a project that I inherited when the series was set up. One of the first books that we actually signed up was this one, Glories to Useless Heroism, the journals of the Comte de Malatic in the French and Indian War in North America. And this was a project that I knew that Will Raffle had been wanting to do for quite some time, and hadn't been able to find a publisher. And one of the great things that we were able to do with the series was give authors the opportunity to publish on topics that previously mainstream publishers hadn't been prepared to take a punt on, and do some of the more obscure areas of 18th century history, and indeed to do 18th century history at all, because there was precious little of it until we got the series up and running. And this was the first of the memoirs that we did. We've done several more since then. Another, sticking with the French and Indian War, and sticking with the French perspective for that matter, this time a compendium of accounts that Charles Mayhood put together, one of last year's releases, looking at the Siege of Quebec from a variety of different perspectives. Staying with the same war again, but changing sides, we had A Redcoat in America, the diaries of Lieutenant William Bamford, and that one came about because the editor initially contacted me to find out if I was a descendant of William Bamford. I'm not, but from that conversation the book developed, and this one is an account of Bamford's service in the French and Indian War, in the Caribbean after that, and in the early stages of the American Revolutionary War as well. Moving further on, with the Guards in Flanders, Captain Roger Morris, an account there, edited by Peter Harrington of the Anne S. K. Brown collection, which has very generously made available a number of the images that grace the covers of quite a few of our books. And Peter chose to bring out this account, which hasn't been published before. And it's one of the many titles, as you'll see as we go through the rest, that deal with the campaigns of the 1790s, another era that's been somewhat neglected in comparison with the Napoleonic campaigns that came afterwards. Another collection of memoirs, Russian ones this time, translated by Darren Boland and annotated. I don't recall ever seeing another Ranks account of the Russian army in the Napoleonic Wars in print in English before, but here we have 2 accounts by private soldiers and one by a junior officer, all annotated and illustrated with maps and so forth. Inevitably, if we're talking about Napoleonic memoirs, we have to have something edited by Gareth Glover, who was possibly the most prolific compiler of such accounts. This one is a particular favourite of mine. It's certainly not the traditional tales of how I won the war with Wellington. It's the seamy side of the British Army. John Harley was a paymaster, and there are various accounts of shenanigans and scandals and all the bits that don't normally make it into the history books. And again from Gareth, the letters of Ulrich Barlow, a light infantryman with Wellington, 52nd Foot in the Peninsula, then the 69th at Waterloo, letters this time, as I say, rather than a memoir. So a very very immediate sense of what was going off in the war. An annotated reissue of a well-known Peninsula memoir, William Brown of the 45th, with Steve Brown. Again, no relation. We have this coincidence of names, it would seem. A debut book by Eamon O'Keefe, a student of military music in the era, who I think was initially drawn to it by the connection to the painting that's ended up on the cover of the band of the Staffordshire Militia. But Thomas Jackson's is a really interesting account from this era. He takes him right from enlistment through service in the militia to transferring into the Coldstream Guards, to active service, to losing a leg and recovering from that, and then finally to life on a pension. So it really is the complete experience of the British Army in this era. And lastly, in terms of memoirs, my own first contribution to the series, William Hay of the 12th Light Dragoons, and his account of the Peninsula and Waterloo campaigns, and also of service in Canada after the war, which is an interesting extra tacked on to the end of it. So that's the eyewitness stuff. Inevitably, of course, we've had a fair share of battle studies. The first one that we were able to do was this. On Gladsmuir shall the battle be, the Battle of Preston Pans. We've tried to do quite a lot with the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, with the anniversary coming up this year, and hopefully we'll still be able to have our anniversary conference in September, which indeed will be at Preston Pans, and co-organised by Aaron Johnson, who's written this account of the battle and is now the chairman of the Scottish Battlefields Trust. I mentioned we've done a lot with the 1790s. We've got more coming on that, but one book that was very well received when it came out was this one, We're Accustomed to Do Our Duty, the German auxiliaries serving with the British Army. Another one that's both a campaign history but also a detail of the uniforms and the equipment and the flags, and really anything else you want to know about these German troops, Hanoverians, Brunswickers, Hessians, and so forth. And of course, while all that was going off in Europe, there was also a campaign in the West Indies, which Steve Brown brought to life in this book. Another excellent Peter Dennis cover there as well. Gray's campaign in the West Indies. In which really the military successes which Steve outlines get forgotten and rather overshadowed by the eventual tragedy that was the yellow fever epidemic that crippled that army. Later still in the 1790s, the Secret Expedition, the campaign to North Holland in 1799, written by Geert van Uythoven. We initially contacted Geert because we wanted to translate the book he'd written in Dutch some years ago about this campaign, Voorts Bataven, and Geert's response was, well, yes, you can translate it if you like. Indeed, I can translate it for you. But while I'm about it, I've got an awful lot of extra stuff I could add as well, and the result is, as you'll see, quite a hefty tome, which will hopefully be the definitive account of that campaign for a very long time to come. We move on to the Peninsula War. Kent and White, having a look at the French invasion of Portugal in 1810-1811. The Battle of Busaco in particular getting a good treatment in there. One or two people thought the book ended rather suddenly with the French before the lines of Torres Vedras. There is a reason for this, and that reason is there's going to be a sequel, and the driving of the French from Portugal and the fighting around the borders at Fuentes de Onoro and Almeida are going to be covered in a second book. So there is method to the madness, and the story will continue. And finally, inevitably, there has to be Waterloo in there somewhere. Hopefully a slightly different look at the battle, though. This is quite a focused treatment, looking at the experiences of a single light cavalry regiment in Wellington's army, the 16th Light Dragoons. And David Blackmore is both a historian and a horseman, and was able to bring a great deal of insight to that story, and dig out a number of primary sources, which enable the story to be told for a great part in the words of those who were there and took part with the regiment in the 100 Days campaign. As well as looking at a regiment in a single campaign, we've got a couple of studies that look at a regiment in detail. The one that I'm particularly proud of here is Robert Griffiths' Riflemen. The story of the 5th 60th, the Royal Americans, famously one of the very first regiments to land in the Peninsula in 1808, and to serve all the way through the Peninsula War. Only 2 others can claim that. Rob had quite a challenge with this book. Unlike the 95th Rifles, who we all know in both fact and fiction, there was very little written by the men of the 60th, and so Robert was forced to reconstruct the story from official records, from courts martial, and from various letters and papers that have survived, and he's done a phenomenal job. And again, it's a weighty tome, and it stands to be the definitive book, I think, on that topic for a great deal of time to come. We haven't done many biographies in the series. We have done a couple, though. Moving back to the Jacobites, we've got this study by Jonathan Oates, one of the most prolific authors around on that topic. King George's hangman, Henry Hawley, probably the villain for many people of the 45, famously defeated, of course, by the Jacobites at Falkirk. And what Jonathan does in this book, it's a warts and all study. Hawley was a fascinating character, both good and bad elements to him, with a very long and interesting military career of his own that's really rather overshadowed by his rather disastrous battlefield command. And what Jonathan does is to take us through that career and show how Hawley's past experiences and his approach to military thinking shaped the way he conducted that campaign, and ultimately helps explain why the battle was the disaster for the government forces that it turned out to be. The other biography that we've done is this one, moving to a Napoleonic topic again. John Harding Edgar is actually a descendant of the subject, Sir George Murray, who was Wellington's chief of staff for the bulk of the Peninsula War. And really, this is both a biography and a study of how Murray grew as a staff officer and how that partnership with Wellington developed and worked through the Peninsula War, and it brings out a side of Wellington, for that matter, that hasn't really been explored before. I mentioned series conferences. We've had 2 so far. The third one, sadly, is currently postponed, but we hope to reschedule it for later in the year. The proceedings of our second conference are about to be published, but the first one that we had in 2018, held up at the York Army Museum, is in print. A fascinating selection of papers looking at the aspects of command and leadership across the period covered by the series. We've got papers in here dealing with the Austrian army, as you can see from the cover, with the French army in Canada, with the Portuguese army in the Peninsula War, with both the Jacobite forces in the 45 and the government army opposing them, and then a series of case studies of campaigns in the French Revolutionary Wars, going right through from the 1790s in Flanders to the Egyptian campaigns. So another area that we wanted to cover in the series was the naval side of the history, and we did that from a fairly early stage with Quentin Berry's book on the blockade of Brest during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and I'm sure people will be familiar with Quentin's vast range of other Helion titles on naval and military history across different areas. He's one of our most prolific authors. Also on the naval front, a bit of an experiment this, and we'd love to know what people think and whether they'd like to see more of this sort of stuff. Our only reference book in the series so far. This is a biographical dictionary of naval officers during the 7 Years' War, British Royal Naval officers, that is. And as you'll see from the entries, there are details of service for every commissioned officer who served during that war. So it's a book to dip into rather than a book to read cover to cover, certainly. And we should be interested to know whether people think there's a market for more things of a similar nature. Bit more conventional. We had earlier on Darren Boland's translation of Russian military memoirs. This rather chunky tome is part memoir, part history. It's a history, but written by somebody who took part in the events described. Vladimir Broniewski, who was a midshipman with the Russian fleet under Senyavin in the Mediterranean during the Napoleonic Wars, and he tells the story of that fleet's operations, of the places they visited, and also his personal experience as a young sailor during those campaigns. And of course there's the connection between naval operations and operations on land, and John Dillon, who again has written for Helion on other topics and other eras, delivered this recent title, which looks at the Royal Navy's support for the British Army during the American Revolutionary War. Rather appropriately, under current circumstances, we've had a couple of books looking at the medical side of the military history of the era. This one by Padraig Lenihan, which actually stretches somewhat earlier as well. We've stolen some ground from Century of the Soldier here, for which I hope my colleague Charles Singleton will forgive me. So we're going back to 1648 and all the way through to 1789, looking at how epidemics have affected military operations in camp, on the march, and particularly during sieges during that time. And of course the bulk of casualties throughout the era were from illness rather than the bullet and the blade. But having mentioned the bullet and the blade, our other medical title, again not one to dip into while you're eating perhaps, is Mick Crumplin and Gareth Glover's study of the medical care that was available for the wounded after Waterloo, illustrated with some really rather graphic surgical drawings from the time, showing where musket balls went in and came out and the damage that was done. And I think what's remarkable is that quite a few of these people have actually survived these really rather unpleasant injuries, and the stories of that are contained within the book. But we know that for a lot of people, one of the main things that attracts them to the series are the uniform books, and there are quite a few of those to review as well from over the past years. One which is perhaps a little different to the others is Ben Townsend's Fashion and Regulation, Regulating Fashion. There are in fact 2 volumes of this now in print. The second one is available, but as yet a copy has not made its way from Helion headquarters to me, so you'll have to take my word for that one, but it is available on the website. But it takes the same model as Volume 1, which is to look at the regulations of the British Army uniforms during the Napoleonic era, but to intersperse that with short essay chapters on, for example, the trend in hussar dress, or Highland fashion, rifle fashions, and so forth, using contemporary accounts and records, and illustrated throughout, and particularly in the colour section, with a number of beautiful contemporary depictions of the really rather splendid uniforms that were seen about the town, even if they weren't necessarily seen in quite that form on the battlefield. But for the most part, if you're thinking uniform books, you'll think of the falconet format, as we call it, the little paperback volumes, and there are certainly a fair few of those. The first couple that we did were a slight departure from the norm, in that they primarily reproduce, rather than new artwork from existing sources, topped up with a few new pieces. And these both relate to the campaigns in Egypt during the end of the French Revolutionary Wars. The first one by Yves Martin, dealing with the French forces and beautifully illustrated with pieces from his collection. And then the second by Carol Duval, looking at the British, with again some material from Yves' collection, and also a number of other drawings depicting the British and Allied troops that fought with them. There was supposed to be a third volume. This was supposed to be a trilogy. We were going to have the Turks as well, and for various reasons that didn't happen. You'll be pleased to know, those of you who were hoping to see that volume, that we have as an alternative now commissioned a title which will look at the Turkish army in the Napoleonic Wars as a whole. So it'll be a rather bigger book than those two, and it won't just look at Egypt, but it will hopefully fill that gap for those of you who wanted the Turkish and Mameluke uniforms for that campaign as well. Something I was very keen to do when we set the series up was something on the Dutch army in the high 18th century. It's an army that seems to have been rather neglected in terms of books detailing uniform and organisation in the English language. There's plenty out there in Dutch. So we have these two volumes. Orange and the States, detailing the forces of the Dutch Republic during this time. A couple of lovely contemporary paintings for the covers, and then drawings by Mark Allen depicting the uniforms, so that anybody wanting to recreate them in lead or plastic knows what colour things need to be painted. We've done much the same for another forgotten army, or less well-known army perhaps, that of Saxony. Marco Pagan's 2 volumes on that, with again some lovely new illustration, this time by Francois Saudelli. Again, some really rather grand uniforms here. A little bit more specific. Stephen E. Borrett's the Swiss regiments in French service during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and this time again you can see a variety of contemporary and more modern illustrations to depict what was being worn there, as well as organisational details and an awful lot of source material on the minutiae of dress and accoutrement. Going back to our recurring theme of the Jacobites in the 45, we've done a couple of books that we launched up at the big reenactment at Preston Pans a few years ago, where we hope to be returning this autumn for our extra series conference on the 45. The first of these was Jen Scott's Better is the Proud Plaid, looking at the dress of the Highland Army, illustrated both with modern plates and some contemporary images. And fans of that book should note that the prequel has just been launched as part of the Century of the Soldier series, looking at the Highland Army in the earlier Jacobite campaigns going back into the 17th century. And then to complement that, my own other offering for the series, with a beautiful piece of cover art by Steve Noon, looking at the French contribution to the 45, and this one looks at both the uniforms and organisation, but also at the backgrounds of the men who fought in the ranks of the Irish pickets and the Royal Ecossoise, who were sent across to assist the Jacobites in that campaign. And to some extent, as I say, that book already moves a little bit away from purely being a uniform book, and we've also used the falconet format for other projects that are not directly related to uniforms and dress. One of the advantages of a small book of 50,000 words is that we can do focus studies of some of the smaller battles. We've got some coming out later this year and into next, looking at some of the smaller Peninsula War battles. But one of the first that we did in that way was this one, looking at the Battle of Stony Point during the American Revolutionary War, with illustrations by Ed Dovey, and colour maps, which obviously with the Falconet format we can do and make use of the extra page space. In a similar fashion, we were able to do another of Neil Cogswell's studies. This one looking at the Reichsarmee, which often rather gets written off for its part in the 7 Years' War. People tend to remember the defeat at Rossbach and forget the rest of the service it put in. But in this one, we have a full account of the Reichsarmee's involvement in the 1758 campaign, along with some contemporary illustrations of the men who served in its ranks, and some beautiful reconstructions of some of the colours that they marched beneath. And for fans of the Horace St Paul saga, there are a few letters to him from a French contact in the appendices as well. Another title which, again, an author whose name you'll recognise from earlier on, Geert van Oithoven, looking this time again at some Dutch military history, but the campaign to liberate the Netherlands during the closing weeks and months of the Napoleonic Wars, and the contribution in particular of the Saxon army. They tend to fall out of history after they defect to the Allies at Leipzig, but of course they then fought in the Allied ranks for the remainder of the war, and this title tells the story of what happened to them, with some beautiful illustrations there by Christa Hook. Another study here which, much like my consideration of the French in the 45, looks as much at the backgrounds of soldiers as it does at what they actually got up to on the battlefield. This one by John Rees, looking at the African American contribution to the Continental Army during the American Revolution. We tend to think of black loyalists fighting for the British Crown, but as John has found out by digging into pension records and other primary sources, there were a large number of African American soldiers who fought on the Patriot American side, and this title tells their story in considerable detail. And again, a bit of an experiment. I think if we'd done this book 2 years ago, it would probably have been a monograph. It's an academic study initially developed from an MA thesis by a young Canadian historian, Nicholas Kaiser, looking at the frigate battles in the War of 1812. The reason we put it into the Falconet format, though, as well as being able to give it some lovely cover art, was that we could then reproduce the drawings at a common scale of some of the pairs of ships that fought one another in these engagements. Lovely artwork here by Florian Richter, and if you're familiar with our Paperboys series, you maybe remember the book he did on the fleets at Trafalgar, using the same sort of artwork. So you can see here, for example, the size difference between one of the big American frigates and the British frigate opposing them. We've also done a few large format uniform titles. The first of these was Godoy's Army, looking at the Spanish at the turn of the 18th to 19th centuries. This really is a remarkable story. The original manuscript from which these images came was tracked down in an antique shop and rescued, and we've now been able to reproduce that, working with Alan Perry of Perry Brothers fame, who owns the original, and Charles Esdale, who many of you will know as the leading expert on the Spanish army writing in this country. in the similar fashion, we were able to reproduce lovely series of prints from a series by Boisselier looking at the Neapolitan army, Murat's army, during the Napoleonic Wars, possibly one of the most colourful armies to take the field during those conflicts, even if its military prowess was rather less impressive. That's a full series of 99 plates with an introduction and commentary by one of the veterans of Napoleonic uniform history, Digby Smith. And lastly and most recently, starting a new multi-volume set in that large format, David Wilson looking at the Danish army of the Napoleonic Wars. This has been incredibly well received since it came out earlier this year. You'll see it's in full colour throughout, with over 50 plates, as well as the very detailed text looking at how the Danish army was equipped and uniformed. There are 2 more volumes coming in the same format. We've been asked, is he going to do the Swedish as well? The answer is yes, if he's spared. We've before that we've got books lined up from him for the Piedmontese army in the War of the Austrian Succession, and also the French army in that war, which, as you can imagine, is going to be quite a big undertaking. So 2 more volumes of Danes, some 1740s stuff, and then he promises he might get round to the Swedes if he's still with us. So watch this space.